America in the 1860s, a vast wilderness from the Mississippi to the Pacific. The plan? A railroad through 1,600 miles of hostile territory. To build it, men risked avalanches, deadly explosions, Indian attacks, gunfights. In the process, they united a far-flung nation. The Transcontinental Railroad, next on Modern Marvels.
America's Wild West, an untamed land symbolizing freedom, opportunity, wealth. In the middle of the 19th century, it was as exotic a frontier as outer space is today. The cry of gold in California triggered an extraordinary stampede of fortune seekers from all corners of the world. When California became a state in 1850, America dreamed of uniting the remote West with the East. But there was one hitch. The journey across the continent was like a slow waltz to the moon. Travelers had to endure one of three miserable, life-threatening choices. Riding on horseback for a month through the malaria-infested jungles of the Panama Isthmus. A 4-month sea voyage around Cape Horn, or several harrowing months crossing the American frontier by wagon, horse, or foot.
At the beginning of the railway age in this country, in the 1830s and 40s, our transportation took place at roughly the same, in the same manner as it had in ancient Rome. We still moved things by animal power at 4 miles an hour, or at best in a sailing ship. The railroads changed that. And very suddenly, we were able to go 20, 30, 40 miles per hour. We were able to cover in one day the distance it used to take a week or longer to go.
Invented in England in 1825, the steam engine was first imported a year later to America and put to use in the Pennsylvania coalfields. By the 1850s, the railroad annihilated distances at 25 miles per hour throughout the East and all the way to the Mississippi River. Roughly 10,000 miles of track linked cities on the east side of the river by 1853. But it was a terrifying iron monster, dirty, dangerous, and often fatal. The technology of steam made explosions, breakdowns, and fires a terrifying reality. Despite the flaws, some people envisioned the railroad as the key to westward expansionism. But a railroad all the way to the Pacific seemed to be an impossibility. 1,600 grueling miles of vast, empty space separated Kansas City, the railroad's westernmost stop, from the Pacific. In between were two massive mountain barriers, the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra, peaks towering over 14,000 feet, and a scorching hot desert. The dream of building a transcontinental railroad became an all-consuming obsession for two young men, two ambitious civil engineers. One lived in California, the other on the East Coast. Although they never met, they shared the same passionate belief. Before he was 28, Ted Judah had already engineered the spectacular Niagara Gorge Railroad in New York. But his vivid imagination and optimism drove him to conjure up the grandest railroad of all. The biggest obstacle was finding a route through the difficult, seemingly impassable Sierra Nevada mountain range.
He knew it could be done, and he devoted every waking hour and every increment of his energy to convincing others that it was possible. And it got to the point where people would literally cross the street to avoid confronting him on a sidewalk. He was known as Crazy Judah and called that to his face.
Crazy Judah set out to the Sierra on horseback. With him, he took his notebooks to record a path across the mountains. But after months of fruitless searching, he ran into a dead end. Frustrated to the point of despair, he received a letter that would dramatically change everything.
Dr. Daniel Strong, a druggist and physician from Dutch Flat, had done surveying work himself for a wagon road in the area, and he pointed out to Judah in a letter that there was a natural inclined plane, a ramp, which would allow Judah to connect his surveyed route with a line that would carry him over the mountains at Donner Lake. This was an exciting discovery, and it really transformed Judah's harebrained scheme into an idea that would really be something that could be achieved.
The following summer, Judah returned to the Sierra and completed a brilliant survey. He located an extraordinary series of ridges that could carry a rail line through the Sierra and then down to Nevada. While Judah continued his survey, another visionary in the East dreamed of a transcontinental railroad. As a high-strung, driven young man, Grenville Dodge rebelled against the confines of New England society types, declaring, "They are a stench to my nostrils." Dodge confided his dream to his sister.
Soon you'll be whirled along by steam, never dreaming that 4 years before it was a wild open country inhabited only by wild beasts and the red man.
Dodge risked his life to prove it could be done. Secretly, he ventured into Indian territory to survey a rail line. But back on the East Coast, no one bought his dream. When the Civil War broke out, Dodge wrangled a colonel's commission in the Union Army, but the railroad would remain his obsession. Back in Sacramento, Ted Judah had more luck persuading 4 merchants to finance his dream. They would be known to history as the Big Four of California. Charles Crocker was a crude, loud, hard-drinking giant with fiery red hair who owned a dry goods store. Charles P. Huntington and Mark Hopkins operated the largest hardware enterprise on the Pacific Coast. Huntington had come to California to mine for gold, but gave it up after only 1 morning of digging. Hopkins was a soft-spoken vegetarian who knew how to drive a shrewd bargain. The 4th member, Leland Stanford, longed to become governor and would get his wish sooner than even he imagined.
They were all involved with Republican politics. They were abolitionists. They were interested in making sure California stayed connected with the Union. They were also shrewd Yankee businessmen who knew a business opportunity when they saw it.
The Big Four and Judah began the Central Pacific Railroad on the 2nd floor of Huntington and Hopkins' hardware store. Judah was sent to Washington as an accredited agent of the Central Pacific. Ted Judah helped Congress draft the Pacific Railroad Act that established 2 companies, Central Pacific to build east from Sacramento, and the Union Pacific to build west from Omaha. The timing was perfect. The year was 1862, and with the outbreak of the Civil War, congressmen were anxious to see the railroad built quickly.
For Abraham Lincoln, the creation of the Pacific Railroad was not so much a commercial act or an act of technology as it was a political act. We had to connect the East with the West in the same way as Lincoln was trying to preserve the North and the South as one country.
The government agreed to loan companies up to $48,000 per mile of track built and turn over land grants running alongside the railroad route. For each mile of rail completed, the companies would be awarded 20 square miles of land. It was a fortune in real estate. And since no meeting point was determined for the 2 competing railroads, the owners of the Central Pacific in the west and the Union Pacific in the east got set for a race to see who could fling the most track across the country. In Sacramento, this urgency suited the Big Four's entrepreneurial appetite. But even before the work started, the Big Four and Judah came to loggerheads as to how their railroad would be built. They wanted to build it as quickly and cheaply as possible, and Judah fought for quality. Feeling betrayed, Judah headed east, hoping to find new financial support to buy his partners out. In a hurry, Judah took the 30-day shortcut to the East Coast through the Isthmus of Panama, an overland crossing before the canal was built.